You may have grown up, lived through many roles in life, and yet there is a part within you that has been quietly waiting to return. That is the inner child, the part that was once overlooked, forced into silence, or had to learn how to be strong too early, before it was ready. Carl Gustav Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." If lately you've been feeling tired without knowing why, easily moved by small things, or carrying an old sadness you cannot quite name, then this video is for you. This is not a lecture, and it is not a collection of hollow advice. This is time for you to return to what Jung called the descent, the journey of meeting yourself at the deepest layer of the psyche. Because according to Jung, what is seen with compassion begins to transform on its own. The child within you does not need to be fixed. It only needs to be acknowledged. Hello, my name is Milo, and I will be accompanying you through this night. For the next hour and more, you do not need to try to heal. You only need to be present. Now, gently bring your attention to your breath. There is no need to change it. Simply feel the air moving in and out, slowly, steadily, like a natural rhythm your body has known for a very long time. As you soften in this way, you may sense yourself standing within a larger inner space, a vast inner universe, where personal worries grow smaller, yet your presence itself remains meaningful. The only intention in this moment is to enjoy the comfort of your bed, to soothe the body, and to allow the mind to rest. Stay with this video, not to learn something new, but to remember who you were before the world asked you to become someone else. And as your body begins to rest, we will allow the story to flow on its own like a distant river, without requiring you to follow it or remember anything at all. The encounter between Carl Gustav Jung and Sigmund Freud did not begin with a handshake or a face-to-face conversation, but with a book. When Jung first approached the interpretation of dreams, he was not yet able to grasp the entirety of the theoretical system Freud was unfolding. But more important than intellectual comprehension at that moment was a powerful intuition. Jung sensed that he was standing before a work ahead of its time, a voice emerging from the deepest layers of the human mind, a realm that orthodox science of the era still carefully avoided. Jung did not read Freud as a disciple absorbing doctrine. He read him as an inner explorer, someone who had long suspected that the human mind does not operate according to the purely rational logic of consciousness. Freud, through dreams, had opened a door Jung, guided by intuition and clinical experience, immediately felt the gravitational pull of that door. Jung later admitted that reading Freud gave him the feeling of encountering a truth he had long intuited, but had not yet been able to name. What convinced Jung most deeply was not Freud's theoretical conclusions, but his ethod. Freud dared to place dreams long regarded as chaotic and meaningless at the very center of psychological life. This resonated powerfully with what Jung was already doing in his Zurich laboratory through word association experiments. There, Jung did not seek correct answers, but observed moments of deviation, hesitation, slips of the tongue, unexpected emotional reactions. These phenomena revealed that some force beneath consciousness was intervening. Freud called this force the unconscious. Jung found empirical evidence for its existence. This intellectual meeting soon developed into an unusual mentor-student relationship. Freud saw in Jung a worthy successor, not only because of Jung's scientific ability, but also because Jung was not Jewish. A fact Freud believed in the European context of the time would help psychoanalysis gain wider acceptance. Jung, for his part, regarded Freud as a spiritual father, a man courageous enough to break through the greatest taboos of Western civilization. Yet even within this admiration, the seeds of conflict had already been sown. Freud approached the unconscious primarily as a repository of repressed desires, especially sexual impulses. Jung, however, experienced the unconscious as a living reality, vast, dynamic, and rich in symbols. Though Jung did not openly challenge Freud in the early period, inwardly he had already begun to ask a critical question. Could the human psyche truly be reduced to a single principle? Freud famously wrote, "Dreams are the royal road to the unconscious." This statement became a cornerstone of psychoanalysis. Jung agreed with Freud on the essential point: the unconscious lies at the center of psychological life. But for Jung, that royal road did not lead only to personal drives and impulses. It opened into universal dimensions that transcended individual biography. The fateful encounter between Jung and Freud was therefore not merely the birth of an intellectual friendship, but a moment of transformation for psychoanalysis itself. Jung brought into the movement something Freud, for all his genius, approached with caution: religion, myth, and symbol. For Jung, the human being is not merely shaped by personal history, but also carries within the psyche the spiritual inheritance of all humanity. For this reason, the relationship between the two men soon became a field of tension. Freud needed Jung as an ally. Jung needed Freud as a point of departure. But Jung could not remain there. He later acknowledged that absolute loyalty to Freud would have meant betraying his own inner experience. Jung's greatest loyalty was not to a doctrine, but to psychological truth, no matter how lonely that truth might be. In a letter, Freud once warned Jung about the danger of falling into mysticism. Jung did not deny that risk, but he believed the greater danger lay in severing psychology from the symbolic depths of human existence. For Jung, science should not be constrained by fear of what cannot be immediately measured. He later wrote, "I am not what happened to me. I am what I choose to become." This sentence clearly reflects the path Jung chose, a path that began with Freud, but did not end with him. In retrospect, the meeting between Jung and Freud resembles the collision of two tectonic plates. From it arose a massive mountain range called modern depth psychology. Freud laid the foundation. Jung expanded the horizon. Without Freud, Jung might never have found the language to name the unconscious. But without Jung, the unconscious might have remained confined to a scope far narrower than the rich reality of human life. That fateful encounter thus stands not only as the origin of Jungian psychology, but as a testament to a deeper truth. Every genuine intellectual journey begins with inheritance and matures through the courage to depart. Jung met Freud as a student. He left Freud as a man stepping into his own path, faithful to the deepest calling of the psyche. After the fateful encounter with Freud, when the door to the unconscious was first opened through the language of dreams and symbols, Carl Gustav Jung did not stop at theoretical admiration. He returned to the laboratory carrying a quiet yet resolute question. How can the unconscious be not merely inferred, but directly observed within psychological life as it unfolds? If the first phase marked the moment Jung realized that there is something beneath consciousness, then this second phase is where he began to see it in action. Jung did not search for the unconscious in dramatic manifestations. He did not hunt for psychosis or mystical dreams. Instead, he focused his attention on small, ordinary, easily overlooked details. A brief hesitation, a slip of the tongue, an emotional reaction disproportionate to the situation, or an inexplicable lapse of memory. It was precisely in these moments of misalignment that Jung began to grasp a fundamental truth. The human mind does not operate as a unified whole. In his word association experiments, Jung would present a stimulus word: mother, home guilt, money, love death, and measure the participants' reaction time. On the surface, this appeared to be a simple test. But what Jung truly observed was not the answer itself, but the interruption of the stream of consciousness. When reactions slowed, when the voice changed, when emotional currents suddenly surged, Jung understood that an invisible force had intervened. The revolutionary nature of Jung's discovery lies here. the unconscious does not merely hide, it intervenes. It does not remain dormant like a passive storage vault, but behaves as an agent with a life of its own. At the moment of interruption, consciousness no longer holds full command. Another part of the psyche, carrying memories, emotions, and unresolved conflicts, suddenly seizes control. Jung called these structures complexes. But in Jung's understanding, a complex is neither a simple psychological problem nor a disorder. It is a living emotional knot formed around an experience of intense emotional charge, often in childhood, that was never fully integrated into consciousness. Jung wrote in the collected works, "Complexes are psychic fragments which have split off owing to traumatic influences or certain incompatible tendencies." What is crucial here is the phrase "split off." A complex is not something newly added to the psyche. It is a part of the psyche that has been separated from its natural developmental flow. It exists at the margins of consciousness, yet it is far from weak. On the contrary, a complex carries a powerful emotional charge strong enough to disrupt thought behavior and even one's sense of self. Here, Jung moves one subtle yet decisive step beyond Freud. Freud focused on symptoms, expressions of repressed drives. Jung focused on moments when consciousness falters, when the I is no longer fully itself. It was precisely there that Jung realized what we call personality is in fact a fragile arrangement among multiple psychological centers. A complex, according to Jung, can behave like a sub-personality. It has its own voice, its own emotions, its own logic. When activated, a person no longer responds from the present, but from an unhealed past. This explains why a casual remark can trigger an outburst, why a familiar look can make us shrink like a child, and why we often say, "I don't understand why I reacted that way." Jung described this with striking clarity. Complexes interfere with the intentions of the will and disturb the conscious performance. They produce disturbances of memory and blockages in the flow of associations. A complex, therefore, is not merely unconscious content. It is a force that takes control. And as long as complexes operate in the shadows, human beings live under the illusion of free choice, while in reality, many crucial reactions have already been determined by unconscious structures that remain unrecognized. What gives this discovery its deep healing value and marks it as distinctly Jungian is Jung's attitude toward complexes. He did not view them as enemies to be eliminated. Instead, he regarded them as messengers of the psyche, signaling where psychic energy has become stuck. A complex reveals where inner life was once overloaded, yet never truly heard. Here we can see a subtle thread connecting back to the journey Jung began with Freud. Freud opened the unconscious through dreams. Jung continued to open it through everyday moments where we stumble over words, forget names, or overreact. If dreams are the nighttime language of the unconscious, then complexes are its daytime language. At this point, Jungian psychology begins to diverge from the ambition to merely treat symptoms and moves toward a deeper dimension, listening to fragmentation. Jung understood that human beings do not become whole by erasing the unwanted parts of themselves, but by recognizing and entering into dialogue with them. A complex once made conscious no longer needs to seize control. The energy locked within it can be released back into creative life. Thus, from word association experiments that might appear dry and technical, Jung uncovered a profoundly human truth. We do not suffer because we are weak, but because parts of us were never allowed to speak. And those very parts, when pushed into the shadows, will find indirect ways to express themselves through slips of speech, wandering thoughts, and nameless fatigue. This second phase, therefore, is not merely a scientific advance. It is the foundation for the entire Jungian journey that follows from the shadow to anima, and animus to the process of individuation. For before a human being can become whole, they must face the first and most uncomfortable truth of all. I am not a unified entity, and this is not a failure, but the starting point of healing. From the word association experiments, where complexes revealed themselves as emotional centers with lives of their own, Carl Gustav Jung gradually arrived at a conclusion he could no longer ignore. The unconscious does not merely react when repressed. It acts as an independent subject. This realization became the natural bridge from Part 2 to Part 3. And at the same time, the first fissure in Jung's intellectual relationship with Sigmund Freud. In Freud's model, the unconscious is conceived as a layer pushed downward. Unacceptable impulses, primarily sexual in nature, are repressed by consciousness and social norms. The unconscious, in this framework, is the result of a defensive act. It exists because consciousness does not allow certain contents to appear. In other words, the unconscious is the prison of forbidden desires. Jung, stepping out of the laboratory and confronting the living data of the psyche, began to question this foundational assumption. If the unconscious were merely a product of repression, why would many contents that had never been forbidden, never involved in moral conflict, nonetheless withdraw from consciousness? Why could complexes intervene in behavior even when there was no clear conflict with social norms? From this point, Jung advanced a revolutionary proposition. Not all unconscious contents are repressed. Many simply cannot coexist with the current structure of consciousness. They are not pushed down. They withdraw on their own. Jung stated unequivocally, "The unconscious is not a dumping ground for refuse, but a living system with its own autonomy." This sentence marks a clear boundary between two conceptions of the psyche. For Jung, the unconscious is not a lower layer of consciousness, but a parallel dimension operating according to its own logic, its own rhythm, and requiring no permission from the ego to exist. This explains why, in the association experiments, Jung observed reactions that bore no defensive character. Participants did not appear avoidant, ashamed, or resistant, yet they were still interrupted. This showed that certain contents had never been repressed, yet were still not conscious. They stood at the margins, not because they were forbidden, but because the ego was not yet expansive enough to contain them. Here, Jung began to see the ego no longer as the legitimate ruler of the psyche, but merely as a center of orientation. When the ego is immature, rigid, or overly identified with a particular image, many parts of the psyche will automatically split off in order to preserve the energy and integrity of the whole. For this reason, Jung did not view fragmentation as an initial pathology. He saw it as a self-regulating strategy of the psyche. This led to a profound theoretical turning point. The unconscious is not the enemy of consciousness, but a misunderstood partner. Jung expressed this in language very different from Freud's. The unconscious can make a fool of the ego. A short sentence, yet it contains a radical reversal. The ego is not the supreme subject. It can be outmaneuvered, influenced, even deceived, not by base desires, but by unintegrated parts of the psyche itself. It was precisely here that the relationship between Jung and Freud began to fracture irreparably. Freud perceived in Jung's view a threat to the scientific status of psychoanalysis. He feared that granting autonomy to the unconscious would open the door to mysticism, religion, and elements that could not be empirically verified. Jung, by contrast, feared that reducing the unconscious to a mechanism of repression would impoverish human experience. For Jung, the psyche does not merely react to the personal past. It also carries forces oriented toward the future, unlived potentials, images not yet formed. Jung wrote in 2 essays on analytical psychology. The unconscious is not only the source of evil, but also the source of the highest good. This statement is in essence a declaration of separation. It dismantles the moral dualism that classical psychoanalysis inadvertently maintained consciousness as order, the unconscious as chaos. Jung replaced it with a more complex vision. The unconscious is both dangerous and creative. From here, Jung began to build analytical psychology, not as a system aimed merely at curing illness, but as a map for inner maturation. If the unconscious possesses autonomy, then the goal of therapy cannot be to control or eliminate it. The goal must be dialogue. And this carries profound implications for modern individuals. When we understand that many inner conflicts do not arise from what is forbidden, but from what has not yet been lived, we stop blaming ourselves. Fatigue is no longer a sign of weakness, but a signal that the psyche is demanding an expansion of consciousness. In retrospect, the rupture between Jung and Freud was not a personal tragedy, but the inevitable maturation of an idea. Freud handed Jung the first key. Jung, realizing that the door opened onto a much larger world, chose to step forward, even if it meant walking alone. And it was precisely in that solitude that Jung laid the foundation for a new vision of the human being, not as a creature imprisoned by the past, but as a living process, one in which the unconscious continually invites the ego to expand, to listen, and to become more whole. From the decisive rupture in Part 3, when Carl Gustav Jung asserted that the unconscious is not merely a product of repression, but operates with its own autonomy, a deeper and unavoidable question gradually emerged. If the unconscious does not merely react to what is forbidden, then what truly governs the entirety of human psychological life? It is precisely here that the debate between Jung and Sigmund Freud moved to a deeper level, the level of life energy. In Freud's model, libido is defined with relative clarity. It is sexual energy, the energy of the sexual instinct, which may be transformed or sublimated into social, artistic, or intellectual activities. Freud believed that regardless of its form, the ultimate driving force of the psyche could be traced back to a single central origin: repressed sexual desire. Jung, after many years of clinical observation and dialogue with his own unconscious, gradually recognized the limits of this perspective. He did not deny the role of sexuality, but he rejected the reduction of the entirety of human psychological motivation to a single instinct. To Jung, such an approach was like attempting to explain all movement in the universe using only gravity, accurate but insufficient. Jung began to expand the concept of libido in a fundamentally different direction. He did not regard libido as a specific energy, but as life energy in general, the energy of the psyche itself, a dynamic force that can flow in multiple directions, depending on psychological structure, developmental stage, and the cultural context of each individual. Jung wrote in Symbols of Transformation, libido is not a concrete instinct, but a general life energy, which manifests itself in various forms. At first glance, this statement may appear academic, but in reality, it contains a profound intellectual revolution. Libido, in Jung's understanding, is not confined to physiology. It can manifest as ambition for power, creative longing, religious devotion, moral ideals, or even the search for meaning in life. Sexuality is only one of many expressions of this energetic current. This explains why Jung could not accept Freud's interpretation of religious symbols, myths, or spiritual experiences as mere disguises of sexual desire. For Jung, these phenomena were not veils concealing a lower impulse, but direct expressions of libido seeking an appropriate form in which to live. Here, Jung introduced a crucial insight. Libido is not oriented solely toward the past. It is also oriented toward the future. If Freud viewed libido as primarily governed by childhood memories and conflicts, Jung perceived within libido an evolutionary force, a natural tendency of the psyche toward expansion, maturation, and completion. Jung expressed this insight with precision. The libido has a teleological aspect. It moves not only from causes, but also toward goals. Psychic energy, according to Jung, is not only pushed by what has already occurred, but also pulled toward what has not yet taken shape. When libido is blocked, a person does not merely develop symptoms. They lose their sense of vitality, creativity, and meaning. Depression, in many cases, is not a lack of pleasure, but a stagnation of life energy. It is here that Jung connected the concept of libido to the deeply human experience of modern life. A person may possess comfort relationships and even social success, yet still feel empty. For Freud, such a state was often explained as unresolved, unconscious conflict. For Jung, it also signaled that libido could no longer find a viable path of expression. Libido becomes trapped, not because it is bad, but because the ego has narrowed its framework of life too severely. When a person identifies exclusively with a single role, the achiever, the good one, the sacrificer, or the rational thinker, libido is forced to flow through an overly constricted channel. The surplus energy does not disappear. It turns inward, manifesting as fatigue, irritability, anxiety, or a sense of meaninglessness. Jung once wrote a short but profound sentence. Energy never disappears. It only changes its form. In Jungian psychology, this statement carries existential significance. Libido cannot be destroyed. If it is not lived consciously, it will seek unconscious expression through symptoms, obsessions, or behaviors the individual cannot understand. From this point onward, the difference between Jung and Freud became irreconcilable. Freud sought to protect the scientific rigor of psychoanalysis through a single governing principle. Jung accepted the risk of complexity because he believed the human psyche to be richer than any linear model could contain. And it was precisely through this expansion of the concept of libido that Jung laid the foundation for all his later work, Archetypes, the self-individuation. If libido is universal life energy, then the psychological journey is no longer a process of discharging desire, but of discovering the right form in which one's energy is meant to live. For listeners today, this insight carries profound consolation. Fatigue does not necessarily mean weakness. It may be a sign that your life energy is being lived in the wrong place. And healing, according to Jung, does not begin with control, but with a fundamental question: where does my libido want to go, and through which patterns have I refused it? This fourth part, therefore, is not merely an academic debate about the concept of libido. It is an invitation to re-examine one's own life as a current of energy seeking its path. And Jung, through his courageous separation from Freud, left us an essential legacy. Human beings do not live merely to resolve the past, but to allow their life energy to become what it was always meant to become. From Part 4, where Jung expanded libido into a universal life energy capable of flowing into creativity, power, faith, or meaning, a natural question follows if life energy is always seeking expression. What happens when it cannot flow? It is precisely at the point of blockage that Carl Gustav Jung introduced a bold methodological shift. Do not interrogate the origin of instinct. Observe where it fails. Within the psychoanalytic tradition of the time, especially under the influence of Sigmund Freud, the question, where does instinct come from, was typically placed at the forefront. Tracing origins, digging backward, explaining sources. This was the familiar path. Jung took a different route. He did not deny the value of tracing origins, but he recognized something more vital for lived experience. Human beings do not suffer because they do not know where instinct comes from, but because they do not know why it no longer functions. Jung regarded instincts as natural functions of life. When they operate harmoniously, there is no need to be conscious of them. We love, act, protect, create as a flow that requires no deliberation. Only when instincts are blocked do they become a problem. And it is precisely then that the psyche begins to speak. Jung wrote a key observation in the collected works. Instincts are typical modes of action, and wherever we find uniform and regularly recurring modes of action, we are dealing with instinct. But Jung did not stop at definition. He asked what happens when those modes of action no longer appear. When a person loses their voice before what must be said becomes paralyzed, before what must be done freezes before what must be chosen. This is not a lack of instinct, but the intervention of the unconscious. Here, Jung reverses the usual approach. Instead of asking, "Where does this instinct come from?" he asks, "Why in this situation can the instinct not appear?" This question moves Jungian therapy away from abstract speculation and directly into lived experience. A person who cannot act is not lacking motivation. A complex is holding the energy back. A person who cannot speak the truth does not lack understanding. The ego is afraid of what might happen if instinct is allowed to speak. Paralysis, according to Jung, is not emptiness. It is overload, frozen in place. Jung once emphasized, man needs difficulties. They are necessary for health. This statement is often misunderstood as an endorsement of endurance. But in a Jungian context, it means something else entirely. Difficulty is a sign that the psyche is attempting to restore balance. When instinct is blocked, difficulty appears not as punishment, but as a demand for consciousness to pay attention. What most profoundly distinguishes Jung from Freud at this point is his attitude toward failure. Freud tended to view symptoms as the result of repressed drives that needed release. Jung viewed blockage as a message that needed to be heard. The unconscious does not always demand discharge. Sometimes it demands a change in the structure of one's life. A person may lose the capacity to love, not because old wounds remain unresolved, but because their present life no longer allows space for authentic feeling. A person may lose creative drive, not because of a lack of talent, but because they are living within a role too narrow for their libido. Where instinct fails, there exists a conflict between life itself and the image the ego is trying to maintain. Jung expressed this with a profoundly human insight. The shoe that fits one person pinches another. There is no recipe for living that suits all cases. When a shoe, a way of living an identity, a standard once fit, but now causes pain, instinct will refuse to cooperate. It does not rebel. It withdraws. And that withdrawal manifests as paralysis, apathy, or the feeling, I am no longer myself. Here Jung once again invites us to shift perspective. Do not ask why I have become weak. Ask what within me is no longer permitted to function. Instinct does not need to be explained by theory. It needs to be given conditions. And those conditions begin with the ego stepping back, honestly observing where it is exerting excessive control. Jung emphasized that the unconscious does not sabotage without cause. When instinct is blocked, the unconscious intervenes to prevent the individual from continuing to live out of alignment with their natural rhythm. This reframes many symptoms: anxiety, depression, loss of direction, in an entirely different light, They are signals of regulation, not system failure. For this reason, Jungian therapy does not rush to restore function through willpower. It begins by identifying precisely where that function has been locked. It does not ask, "How can I act again?" but rather, "What am I not allowing to happen in my life?" Seen this way, Part 5 becomes the natural development of Part 4. If libido is life energy, then instincts are the natural pathways through which that energy once flowed. When a pathway collapses, the energy does not disappear. It accumulates. And the point of accumulation is precisely where the unconscious speaks most forcefully. For listeners today, this message carries a deeply liberating meaning. You are not broken. You have not lost your instincts. You may simply be living within a structure that no longer allows life to move at its proper rhythm. And according to Jung, healing does not begin by forcing yourself to keep going, but by having the courage to stop at the very place where you became stuck and to listen to what instinct, in its silence, has been trying to say on your behalf. From Part 5, where Jung advises us to observe where instinct fails, rather than speculate about its origins. A more fundamental question gradually emerges. Who is failing? When action becomes paralyzed, when words cannot be spoken, when life energy is blocked. This is not the collapse of instinct, but the limit of the ego being reached. And it is precisely at this point that Carl Gustav Jung makes one of his most important contributions to modern psychology. The ego is not a finished entity, but a process unfolding across a lifetime. In everyday experience, we tend to regard the ego as something stable, continuous, and clearly bounded. For Jung, however, this is a convenient illusion. The ego is not the center of the entire psyche. It is only the center of consciousness. It forms gradually, layer by layer, through lived experience, and therefore it is never complete. Jung defined it with simple precision. The ego is the seat of consciousness. This sentence is often skimmed over, yet its implications are profound. The ego is not the whole person, but merely the place where consciousness gathers like an island, rising in the middle of an ocean of the unconscious. And like all islands, its shape changes over time, shaped by currents and by the unavoidable collisions of life. The ego begins to form from the most primitive experiences. Bodily sensation, the boundary between me and not me, between inside and outside. A child learns to distinguish pain from no pain, hunger from satiety, near from far. From this, a center of orientation gradually emerges. But this center is initially fragile, easily overwhelmed by emotions, images, and impulses from the unconscious. According to Jung, the greatest mistake of adulthood is not having a weak ego, but believing that one's ego is finished. When the ego regards itself as a completed product, it stops learning, stops adjusting, and begins to resist whatever does not fit its familiar self-image. It is precisely here that inner conflict arises. Jung once warned, "What we do not make conscious appears in our lives as fate." When the ego refuses to expand in order to contain new experiences, the unlived parts of the psyche do not disappear. They return in the form of fate, incomprehensible repetitions, excessive reactions, sudden crises. Not because life is cruel, but because the ego has fallen behind the development of the psyche itself. Here, Jung directly connects Part 5 and Part 6. Instinct fails, not because instinct is wrong, but because the ego is not yet flexible enough to allow it to operate. When the ego is too tightly bound to a single role, the strong one, the righteous one, the self-sacrificing one, the rational one, it treats all opposing impulses as threats. The result is that life energy becomes locked, and the unconscious is forced to intervene. Jung viewed the ego as a process of learning to endure contradiction. A mature ego is not one that controls better, but one that can hold more emotion, more paradox, more uncertainty. The more rigid the ego, the more the psyche must resort to symptoms to break that rigidity. Jung wrote with striking directness, "The experience of the self is always a defeat for the ego." This statement is not pessimistic, but illuminating. Each time a person touches a deeper layer of themselves, an uncomfortable truth, a denied longing, an insurmountable limit, the ego is compelled to relinquish its illusion of omnipotence. And it is precisely this defeat that opens the possibility of growth. In Jungian psychology, the midlife crisis is not viewed as an accident, but as a sign that the ego requires restructuring. What once helped us survive in youth is no longer sufficient to help us live meaningfully in the second half of life. If the ego stubbornly clings to its old form, life will force change through more painful means. This also explains why Jung never promised self-perfection. He did not believe in an ideal ego without contradiction or wound. He believed in the process of individuation, in which the ego gradually learns to take its proper place, not as the master of the psyche, but as a humble mediator between consciousness and the unconscious. Jung expressed this spirit with clarity. There is no coming to consciousness without pain. The ego can expand only by passing through experiences that destabilize it. Yet this is not disintegration. It is reorganization at a higher level. An ego that knows it is unfinished is an ego that is still alive. For listeners today, those who feel they are no longer themselves, disoriented, or questioning everything they once believed, this perspective offers deep consolation. Perhaps you are not failing. Perhaps your ego has reached its former limits and needs to expand. Anxiety is not a sign of weakness, but a signal that a process of growth is underway. Thus, Part 6 is not merely a theoretical definition of the ego. It is an invitation to live differently. Do not try to finish yourself. Allow yourself to continue becoming. Jung reminds us that the human being is not a project to be completed, but a journey to be continued, one in which the ego, if it learns to listen, can mature alongside the entire psychic life that is constantly moving beneath it. From Part 6, where Jung clarifies that the ego is not a finished product, but an open-ended process, an inevitable consequence emerges if the ego is only a temporary center of consciousness. Then what truly shapes the deeper patterns of psychological life? It is precisely here that Carl Gustav Jung introduces a structural turning point. The Oedipus complex is not the sole center of the psyche. It is only one archetype among many archetypes. Jung did not deny the Oedipus complex. He acknowledged its descriptive power and accepted that tensions between child and parents, particularly conflicts involving power jealousy, love, and hatred, can appear in many individual lives. But Jung opposed elevating a single model into a universal key. For him, treating the Oedipus complex as the exclusive center was like attempting to read all of humanity through an overly narrow lens. This difference strikes at the philosophical foundation separating Jung from Sigmund Freud. Freud viewed the Oedipus complex as the axis of psychological development. The child desires. The opposite-sex parent confronts the same-sex parent, then internalizes prohibition to form the superego. Jung, however, asked a critical question. Why should a model arising from a specific European family structure be capable of explaining every culture, every myth, every historical era? Jung recognized that Oedipus is not merely a family story. It is a symbol, an archetypal image of generational conflict, fate, and awakening consciousness. And like all powerful symbols, it is only one among many foundational structures of the psyche. When taken literally and absolutized, the symbol loses its own depth. Jung wrote in The Collected, "Archetypes are typical forms of behavior, which once they become conscious, naturally present themselves as ideas and images." Here, Jung shifts the axis of analysis from personal content to universal form. Archetypes are not specific memories, nor are they individual family experiences. They are patterns of behavior and imagery that have existed in the collective psyche long before the individual. Seen this way, the Oedipus complex is an archetype of tragic consciousness. The human being is blind to the origins of the suffering they create, and only sees when it is already too late. What Jung challenges is not the existence of Oedipus, but its exclusive authority. If all conflicts are reduced to sexuality and the nuclear family, then other forces, power belief, existential fear, the longing for transcendence are ignored. Jung encountered equally powerful archetypes in myth religion and art: the hero, the shadow, the mother, the father, the trickster, the wise old man, the divine child. Jung emphasized, the archetype is a tendency to form representations of a motif, representations that can vary a great deal in detail without losing their basic pattern. Accordingly, the Oedipus complex is not the sole cause of disturbance, but one possible expression that can arise when archetypes related to power and consciousness are activated in a particular way. In another culture, the same archetype may take an entirely different form, not Oedipus, but a battle among gods, or a hero's struggle against fate. This expansion allowed Jung to explain phenomena that Freud found difficult. Why does the same family conflict lead to radically different psychological outcomes? Why do some crises carry a sense of destiny, even when they do not revolve around parents? Jung's answer was clear. It is not Oedipus that is operating, but other archetypes that have seized the psyche. Here, Part 6 and Part 7 connect seamlessly. The ego is a process. Archetypes are structural foundations. When the ego is immature, it can be possessed by a single archetype, causing the individual to identify their entire psychological life with a repetitive script. As the ego matures, it learns to recognize the coexistence of multiple archetypes and no longer allows any single pattern to dominate absolutely. Jung warned of the danger of archetypal possession. A man who is possessed by an archetype is no longer himself. In such a state, the person no longer lives from the present, but from an ancient script operating automatically. Treating the Oedipus complex as the soul center inadvertently increases the risk of possession. All experience is forced into a predetermined narrative rather than being heard in its uniqueness. For this reason, Jungian psychology does not seek to diagnose quickly using a single model. It invites a more humble stance. The psyche is multi-centered, and maturity arises when a person learns to dialogue with the many forces operating within them. Oedipus may be one of these forces, but it is never the whole. For listeners today, this perspective offers a clear sense of liberation. You are not trapped in a single script. Your conflicts do not need to be endlessly reread through a familial lens. What may be active within you could be the archetype of the weary hero, the forgotten child, or the seeker of meaning. As the frame widens, inner life opens as well. Thus, Part 7 is not a rejection of Freud, but a liberation from the exclusivity of a single model. Jung offered us a wider map, one in which Oedipus stands alongside many other archetypal images, together, telling a larger human story. And within that map, the human being is no longer defined by a single conflict, but understood as a living intersection of multiple archetypes, awaiting consciousness dialogue and integration according to the unique rhythm of each life. From Part 7, where Jung liberated psychological life from the exclusive frame of the Oedipus complex and opened a multi-archetypal horizon. A deeper question immediately arises: if archetypes are merely ideas or symbols, why do they exert such overwhelming power over human beings? It is precisely here that Carl Gustav Jung takes a decisive step further. Archetypes are not concepts to be thought about. They are forces that possess. One of the most common misunderstandings of Jung is to treat archetypes as harmless cultural symbols, beautiful images to be analyzed safely in books. Jung's view is the opposite. He warned that archetypes do not lie dormant in the intellect. They operate as primordial centers of energy, capable of seizing emotions, thought, and behavior without the consent of consciousness. Jung stated this with great clarity. The archetype is a dynamis of force. The word dynamis, force, is the key. An archetype is not a static image, but a living. When an archetype is activated, a person does not merely think according to it. They are swept into it. We do not love by rational decision. We fall in love. We do not calmly choose an ideal. We are called by it. And it is in that moment that the archetype begins to operate. Jung observed that many experiences people regard as personal are in fact deeply impersonal. Love at first sight, sacrificing everything for an ideal being obsessively drawn to a person. Without explanation, these phenomena far exceed personal preference or conscious choice. They bear the unmistakable imprint of an archetype entering consciousness. Jung described this condition with a powerful term, archetypal possession. He wrote, "A man who is possessed by an archetype is no longer himself." This statement is not metaphorical. When possessed, a person loses reflective distance. The ego no longer occupies the coordinating position. It is pushed to the margins. The individual then loves, acts, fights, and sacrifices not from the personal present, but from an ancient script being replayed through them. This explains why Jung consistently warned against romanticizing archetypes. Archetypes do not only give rise to art, religion, and heroic epics. they can also lead to fanaticism, destruction, and loss of self. Human history, in Jung's view, is a succession of periods in which collective archetypes take possession moments when people no longer act as responsible individuals, but as instruments of a larger unconscious force. Jung wrote in The Undiscovered Self, "The bigger the crowd, the more negligible the individual becomes. When archetypes operate at the collective level, individuality easily dissolves." But even in private life, archetypes can function with similar power. A person possessed by the anima archetype may idealize love to the point of self-erasure. A person possessed by the hero archetype may rush into unnecessary battles simply to sustain a sense of meaning. The crucial point is this: human beings do not choose archetypes. Jung emphasized that archetypes happen to people like dreams or emotional storms. The ego can intervene only afterward by recognizing naming and creating conscious distance. Before that moment, we are always in a passive position. Jung expressed this with chilling precision. The gods have become diseases. In the modern world, where mythic images are no longer ritually honored, archetypes do not disappear. They relocate. Instead of appearing as external gods, they operate as inner obsessions, political fanaticisms, or destructive relationships that cannot be abandoned. When archetypes are not made conscious, they do not weaken, they become more dangerous. Here, Part 7 and Part 8 connect organically. If Oedipus is only one archetype among many, Part 8 shows why absolutizing any single archetype is perilous. Archetypes do not merely explain, they possess. When a model is elevated to exclusive truth, it ceases to be a tool of understanding and becomes a ruling force. Jung did not call for escaping archetypes. That is impossible. He called for becoming conscious of our relationship to them. When an archetype is recognized, it loses part of its power to possess and becomes a source of creativity. When it remains unrecognized, it operates as fate. Jung articulated this unmistakably. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. Archetypes, therefore, are not enemies, but they demand maturity of the ego, a maturity prepared in Part 6. Only an ego that knows itself as a process, not an absolute center, can stand before archetypal power without being devoured by it. For listeners today, this message is both sobering and compassionate. If you have ever loved to the point of losing yourself, pursued an ideal to exhaustion, or been drawn into a person or a dream without understanding why you are not foolish, you may have touched a force larger than yourself. And Jung reminds us that maturity does not mean extinguishing that force, but learning to face it with consciousness. Part 8, therefore, is not merely an academic definition of archetypes. It is a profound reminder that human beings do not live by reason alone. We live among ancient, powerful, beautiful, and dangerous forces, archetypes that are always waiting to be lived through us. And the task of Jungian psychology is not to eliminate them, but to help human beings no longer be unconsciously possessed by them, so that they may live lives that are both deep and responsible to themselves. From Part 8, where Jung exposes archetypes as possessing forces capable of sweeping human beings along, despite reason, a natural question arises if these forces are so powerful. What allows a person to still stand before society and live? Carl Gustav Jung's answer is the persona, and it is precisely here that Jung identifies the deep origin of many modern inner conflicts. Persona is not deception. Jung never regarded the persona as a moral flaw. On the contrary, he understood it as a necessary psychological invention. Human beings cannot live naked before society. We need a form, a role, a mode of appearance that is sufficiently appropriate to be accepted to cooperate and to survive. The persona is an intelligent compromise between the complexity of inner life and the simplifying demands of society. Jung defined it with precision. The persona is a complicated system of relations between individual consciousness and society. It is the mask that allows us to step into the world. The problem lies not in wearing the mask, but in the moment we forget that we are wearing it. Here, Jung issues a sharp warning. The persona becomes dangerous when a person identifies with it. When a social role, the successful one, the good one, the strong one, the moral one, is mistaken for the total self, the psyche begins to fragment. The parts that do not fit that image do not disappear. They are pushed into the unconscious, where they accumulate energy and seek a way back. Jung wrote a sentence that is often quoted, but rarely fully understood. The persona is that which, in reality, one is not, but which oneself, as well as others, think one is. This statement is not meant to deny social value, but to remind us that the persona is a shared assumption, not an inner truth. When a person lives too long within that assumption, they begin to perform even when there is no audience. And at that point, inner life becomes depleted. The thread connecting Part 8 and Part 9 lies here. Archetypes possess from within. The persona suppresses from without. One pulls the individual into primordial forces. The other compels the individual to be proper, stable, acceptable. When the persona becomes too rigid, The archetypes that have been repressed will seek to break through it through crisis, obsession, or uncontrollable behavior. Jung observed that many neurotic conditions do not arise from bad instincts, but from excessive identification with the persona. A person who is too good does not permit themselves anger. A person who is too rational does not permit themselves vulnerability. A person who is too moral does not permit themselves doubt. These excluded parts do not vanish. They return as the shadow, often in ways that are shameful or destructive. Jung warned, the more rigid the persona, the more dangerous the unconscious becomes. When the persona turns into armor, the psyche is forced to find another exit. And that exit is rarely gentle. One may be right in social terms, yet profoundly misaligned with oneself. The result is a vague fatigue, an emptiness difficult to name, or anxiety without a clear cause. Symptoms deeply familiar to modern life. Here, Jung does not call on us to discard the persona. That would be childish and dangerous. He calls for establishing a conscious distance from it. That is knowing clearly what role one is playing, and knowing clearly that it is not everything. A healthy persona is flexible and can change with circumstance. A pathological persona is rigid, defensive, and demands to be believed as me. Jung wrote, "One cannot get rid of the persona without damaging the ego." This sentence reveals the subtlety of Jungian thought. Healing does not mean violently tearing off the mask, but expanding the ego so that it no longer needs to cling to the mask as its sole source of value. When the ego matures, as discussed in Part 6, the persona naturally becomes a tool, no longer a prison. What makes the persona a source of hypocrisy is not human badness, but a role system that forces continuous performance. When the gap between who one must be and who one is becomes too wide, a person is compelled to conceal, rationalize, or deny. From there, fragmentation increases, and inner life becomes disjointed. Jung recognized that modern society, with its rapid pace, high standards, and image pressure, encourages identification with the persona. People are rewarded for stability, success, and positivity, and subtly punished for showing contradiction, confusion, or inconvenient longing. But the psyche does not follow social KPIs. It demands truthfulness. Jung emphasized a core principle. There is no coming to consciousness without pain. The pain of separating from the persona is not failure. It is the beginning of maturity. When a person dares to admit, "I am not entirely the image I present," they begin to reclaim the energy locked in performance. That energy can then return to serve creativity, feeling, and meaning. For listeners today, Part 9 carries deep consolation. if you feel that you are living correctly, but not truthfully, if you are exhausted from maintaining an image, if you fear that removing the mask will reveal nothing, underneath Jung would say beneath, it is not emptiness, but life that has not yet been allowed to appear. The persona is not the enemy. It is a doorway. But when we mistake the doorway for the house, we spend our lives standing at the threshold. Jung invites us to step inside, not to destroy society, but to avoid losing ourselves to it. And it is within this subtle movement that inner conflict begins to be understood, not as personal failure, but as the signal of a psyche calling for wholeness. From Part 9, where the persona is exposed as a necessary yet dangerous mask, a place where one can easily lose oneself through excessive identification. A deeper, almost existential question naturally arises: if I am not merely my persona, then who am I really? It is precisely at this point that Carl Gustav Jung introduces the central concept, and also the summit of his entire body of work: the self. The self is not an expanded ego, nor is it a better version of me. Jung is very careful here. The self is not synonymous with consciousness, does not serve social image, and certainly does not obey the ambitions of the ego. The self is the totality of the psyche, including both what we know about ourselves and what we have never dared to know. Jung wrote clearly, "The self is the totality of the psyche, conscious and unconscious." In a single concise sentence, Jung reordered the inner structure of the human being. The ego, what we usually call I, is only a small part within that vast structure. The ego is the center of consciousness. The self is the center of the whole. When the ego confuses its role and takes itself to be the supreme, inner crisis is no longer a possibility. It becomes inevitable. The connecting thread between Part 9 and Part 10 lies here. The persona is the image the ego presents to the world. The self is the reality toward which the psyche moves, regardless of that image. When the ego identifies with the persona, it crowns itself as the whole person. But the self does not accept this reduction. It begins to create friction in the form of fatigue, anxiety, depression, or a sense of meaninglessness to force the ego to reconsider its position. Jung did not view these crises as mistakes. He saw them as signs that the self is speaking. Jung wrote, "Neurosis is always a substitute for legitimate suffering." This sentence is especially important. When the ego refuses the path demanded by the self, the path of expansion, integration, and confrontation with contradiction, the psyche produces symptoms. Not to punish, but to compel the ego to stop. Crisis. according to Jung, is a signal that the ego is living out of alignment with the totality of its own being. The self does not oppose the ego, but the self does not serve the ego. The relationship between these two realities is like that between the driver and the road. The ego may steer the wheel, but it cannot determine the terrain. When the ego tries to force the road to be straight, familiar, and according to plan, the self alters the landscape, sometimes violently. Jung expressed this in a sentence that is both profound and deeply uncomfortable for the modern ego. The experience of the self is always a defeat for the ego. Why defeat? Because to encounter the self, the ego must relinquish the illusion of control, the illusion of perfection, and the illusion that I know who I am. The ego prefers clarity. The self contains paradox. The ego wants consistency. The self includes contradictions that cannot be resolved by reason. For this reason, many people fear the self without realizing it. They label the call of the self as a midlife crisis, loss of direction, or I am no longer myself. But for Jung, this is an ontological moment. It is the point at which the ego has gone far enough to realize that it cannot go on alone. The self often appears in dreams, symbols, and sacred images: the circle, the mandala, the stone, the divine child, the light at the center. Not because the self likes symbols, but because consciousness cannot grasp the self through concepts. The self can only be approached. It cannot be possessed. Jung wrote, "The self is not only the center, but also the whole circumference which embraces both conscious and unconscious." This completely reverses how modern individuals usually think about themselves. We are accustomed to living as though consciousness were the whole. Jung reminds us that consciousness is only a small island, and the self does not demand the disappearance of the ego. It demands that the ego take its proper place. When the ego imagines itself as the center, it begins to exclude emotions deemed inappropriate desires, judged unacceptable fears that are not permitted. But the self does not exclude. The self includes. And everything the ego excludes will return not as part of the self, but as a symptom. Here, Jung directly connects the self with the process of individuation, the journey of becoming a whole human being. Individuation is not self-optimization, but the establishment of a right relationship between the ego and the self. The ego is no longer king. It becomes a loyal servant of a greater order. Jung emphasized, individuation does not shut one out from the world, but gathers the world to itself. This is crucial for those who fear that living authentically means breaking away from society. Jung did not advocate withdrawal. When the ego stands in the right position, beneath the self, a person lives more truthfully in the world, not less. They no longer need a rigid persona, are no longer blindly possessed by archetypes, and no longer require symptoms to speak on behalf of what they refuse to hear. For listeners today, those who feel they have done everything right, yet still feel empty, the concept of the self carries profound consolation. Perhaps you have not failed. Perhaps your ego has reached its limit, and the self is calling you into another mode of living, wider, deeper, and also demanding greater courage. Part 10, therefore, is not merely a theoretical definition. It is the axis around which all Jungian psychology turns. Persona, ego, archetype, shadow, all revolve around this relationship. When the ego knows it is not the center, crisis ceases to be an enemy and becomes a guide. Jung did not promise easy happiness. He promised wholeness. And the self, though, it never belongs to the ego, patiently waits, quietly adjusting inner life until a person is ready to abandon the question, "Who am I?" and step into the deeper and more truthful question, "What am I becoming?" From Part 10, where the self is established as the psychological totality that transcends the ego. A practical, very human question immediately arises if the self is the deep center. How does our psychic energy actually move in everyday life? It is precisely here that Carl Gustav Jung introduces one of the most frequently misunderstood pairs of concepts in modern psychology: introversion and extroversion. Not as personality labels, but as tools for orienting the flow of psychic energy. Jung did not create these concepts to divide the world into two fixed types of people. He used them to describe the dominant direction of movement of libido, the life energy we discussed in Part 4. In other words, introversion and extroversion answer a simple but essential question: where does your energy tend to flow outward toward the external world, or inward toward the inner world? Jung defined this very clearly in psychological types. Introversion means a turning inward of libido. Extroversion, a turning outward of libido. There is no moral element here, no hierarchy of value. No one is better for being introverted or extroverted. These are simply two natural ways the psyche distributes energy in order to adapt to life. The thread connecting Part 10 and Part 11 lies precisely here. The self is the whole. Introversion and extroversion are merely two directions of movement within that whole. When the ego forgets the self and identifies itself exclusively with one direction, imbalance begins. And it is this imbalance, that produces much of the suffering modern society often misinterprets as personality. Jung emphasized a crucial point. There is no such thing as a pure introvert or a pure extrovert. He wrote, "There is no such thing as a pure extrovert or a pure introvert. Such a man would be in the lunatic asylum." The statement is both humorous and incisive. If a person could only turn outward and never inward, they would lose reflection. If a person could only turn inward and never outward, they would lose reality. Life demands movement in both directions. Problems arise when society or the ego itself turns a tendency into a rigid identity. When someone says, "I'm an introvert, so I don't need the world," or "I'm an extrovert, so I don't need inner life," they have transformed a guiding tool into a limiting label. Jung regarded this as a form of false identification. Jung wrote, "The attitude of introversion or extroversion is a bias of the psyche." The word bias is crucial. A bias helps us orient ourselves, but when absolutized, it impoverishes lived experience. When the ego clings rigidly to one bias, the opposite tendency is pushed into the unconscious. And as Jung repeatedly warned, what is pushed down will return as fate. A person inclined toward introversion often has a rich inner life, but may struggle with action, expression, or bringing meaning into the world. If they identify completely with introversion, they may fall into isolation, hesitation, or a sense of not belonging. Conversely, a person inclined toward extroversion is often active, connected, and quick to act, but without the capacity to turn inward. They may lose direction, become dependent on external feedback, and lose their inner voice. Jung observed that psychological crises often arise when the familiar direction of movement is no longer sufficient. When an extrovert is forced to confront solitude, or an introvert is forced to step into the world, the psyche is shocked. But this is not an accident. It is the self-demanding compensation. Jung expressed this principle clearly. The psyche is a self-regulating system. If the ego insists on living only in one direction, the psyche creates circumstances that force a change of direction, not to punish, but to restore balance. Many people describe this phase as a loss of identity, or "I'm no longer myself." But for Jung, it is often a sign of inner maturation. What sets Jung apart from modern personality typing systems lies in purpose. Jung did not want people to know who they are in order to feel secure. He wanted them to know where they are one-sided, so they can adjust. Introversion and extroversion, therefore, are not answers. They are compasses. Jung wrote, "A one-sided conscious attitude leaves the unconscious in opposition." When a person lives too extrovertedly, their unconscious takes on an introverted color through fantasy rumination, or depression. When a person lives too introvertedly, their unconscious takes on an extroverted color through impulsiveness, sudden actions, or an intense craving for recognition. Suffering arises not because one direction is wrong, but because the ego refuses to learn the language of the opposite direction. Here, the connection to the self becomes clear. The self does not favor introversion or extroversion. The self contains both. When the ego stands in the right position, not identified with the persona, not possessed by archetypes, it can learn to move flexibly between the two directions, according to the moment and the demands of life. Jung did not call on people to change their personality. He called on them to expand the range of living. An introvert does not need to become an extrovert. They need the capacity to move outward when necessary. An extrovert does not need to become an introvert. They need the capacity to turn inward when necessary. Maturity, according to Jung, is not about changing labels. It is about widening the spectrum of libido's movement. For listeners today, those overwhelmed by personality tests and labels like high introversion or low extroversion, this message is deeply liberating. You are not locked into a single type. You are moving within a living spectrum. And if you feel tired, stuck, or lost, perhaps the question is not, am I an introvert or an extrovert? But rather, in which direction is my energy currently trapped? Part 11. Therefore is not a lesson in classification. It is a profound Jungian reminder. The self requires both directions in order to become whole. When the ego learns to listen to the neglected direction of movement, inner life begins to soften, widen, and become less conflicted. And it is precisely in this two-way movement that a person no longer needs to live according to a label, but can begin to live according to the true rhythm of their own being. From Part 11, where introversion and extroversion are understood as directions of movement of psychic energy rather than personality. Labels. A final door opens wider than personal life itself. If this current of energy does not operate only within an individual, then where else does it flow? It is precisely here that Carl Gustav Jung leads us to his boldest and most controversial concept, the collective unconscious, the place where personal dreams touch historical destiny. Jung never denied the personal unconscious, the realm that holds memories, complexes, and private conflicts. But he recognized that many images appearing in dreams cannot be traced back to personal experience. They are ancient, universal, recurring across cultures that have never encountered one another. From this observation, Jung proposed a foundational hypothesis beneath the personal unconscious, there exists a deeper layer shared by all of humanity. Jung wrote, "The collective unconscious contains the whole spiritual heritage of mankind's evolution, born anew in the brain structure of every individual. The collective unconscious is not a storehouse of concrete historical memories, but of primordial patterns, archetypes, forms, ready to be filled with the content of each age. And dreams, according to Jung, are precisely the meeting point where the personal unconscious and the collective unconscious converge. The thread connecting part 11 and part 12 lies here. When psychic energy moves collectively, it crosses the boundary of the individual and begins to shape history. Introversion and extroversion are not only matters of me, but can become the prevailing attitudes of a people, an era, a civilization. Jung paid particular attention to dreams not as day residues, but as early signals of deep movements. He called dreams the language the psyche uses when consciousness is still asleep. Not only the psyche of the individual, but at times that of an entire collective. Jung wrote a famous line, "Dreams are the guiding words of the soul." While studying the dreams of many European patients in the years preceding the Second World War, Jung noticed recurring images: floods, monsters, darkness sweeping across the continent, ancient gods awakening. These dreams did not reflect personal trauma. They bore a distinctly collective tone. Jung understood that the European psyche was entering a phase of collective archetypal possession. Later, when Nazism rose to power, Jung did not regard it merely as a political phenomenon. He saw it as the eruption of ancient, unconscious forces, especially the archetypes of the warrior, the shadow, and the god of power activated within a society that had lost connection with a healthy, symbolic life. Jung wrote, "In civilization in transition, the gods have become diseases. When mythological images are no longer contained by ritual religion or reflective consciousness, they do not disappear. They relocate, invading politics, ideology, and mass movements. There they operate blindly, possessing millions of people at once. What is crucial is this: Jung did not believe that history is determined by the unconscious in a fatalistic way. He believed that history is shaped when collective consciousness is not mature enough to enter into dialogue with the collective unconscious. When the individual ego is weak, it is easily swept into the collective. When social consciousness is impoverished, it becomes fertile ground for destructive archetypes. Here, Jung directly connects psychology with moral responsibility. Understanding the unconscious is not meant to satisfy curiosity, but to prevent catastrophe. Jung warned, the psychological rule says that when an inner situation is not made conscious, it happens outside as fate. This statement does not apply only to individuals. A society that refuses to look at its own shadow will live it out externally through war violence and oppression. Historical destiny, according to Jung, is not a chain of random events, but the outcome of psychological processes neglected on a collective scale. This is why the role of dreams becomes so significant. Dreams do not predict history, like prophecy. They prepare the psyche for what is approaching. When human beings learn to listen to dreams, personal and collective, they gain the chance to intervene early before unconscious energy is forced to erupt in destructive ways. Jung did not believe that everyone must become an analyst, but he believed that individual consciousness is humanity's first line of defense. A person who listens to their own unconscious is less likely to be swept into collective fanaticism. A society that honors symbolic life is less likely to be possessed by destructive archetypes. Here, the entire journey from part 1 to part 12 closes into a meaningful circle. From Freud, complexes, libido, ego, persona, self, to introversion, extroversion. All of it leads back to a core Jungian truth. The psyche is not merely a personal matter. It is the invisible foundation of human history. Jung once wrote a statement of declaration. Man's task is to become conscious of the contents that press upward from the unconscious. This is not only the task of a person seeking healing. It is the civic responsibility of every conscious human being. For each time an individual expands consciousness, they not only save their own life, but also reduce the blind power of the collective unconscious. For listeners today, living in a world filled with instability, polarization, and fear, Part 12 carries a message that is both stern and hopeful. History does not merely happen to us. History passes through us. And every dream that is listened to, every shadow that is made conscious, every self that is respected, is a small but meaningful act in shaping our shared destiny. Jung did not promise that understanding the psyche would save the world, but he reminded us of something deeper, a world that does not understand the psyche will inevitably destroy itself. And therefore, the journey into the unconscious, personal, or collective, is not an escape from reality, but a direct path into the place where reality itself is born. And now, as the final words slowly dissolve, not because they have lost their meaning, but because they no longer need to be held by consciousness. Perhaps somewhere very deep, your inner child has been seen, not to be fixed, not to become better, simply to exist. without having to prove anything. Carl Gustav Jung once wrote, "What you resist persists. What you accept transforms." True transformation does not happen when we strive. It happens when we stop resisting and allow what is to be. If sleep is coming, let it come. There is no need to carry this story with you. No need to understand everything. And if you are still listening, know that other journeys are still there, slow, quiet spaces where you can continue returning to yourself whenever you are ready. And for tonight, this is enough. Let the body rest. Let the mind settle. And let the deepest part of you be safe within this stillness. Wishing you a peaceful sleep.